The purpose of this section, the purpose of the timeline, is to add unique value to your story. Remember, chapter 2 is your story. You're writing a story upon completion of reading all the knowledge, all the information that's published about your topic. Therefore, you have done an exhaustive review. You have done this robust review of the literature that you're going to put together and share it in your story. A timeline can help you basically create how what happened in your content area has transpired over time. And when you start to see all the different correlations and causalities that occurred over time, you're going to find that you're going to have a far more valuable chapter 2 than you ever thought possible. One of the points about the timeline is that it can help you to relate causal or correlations from the past to the present. We know at certain times of history when something's happened, there was a different effect because of it. I'll give you one example. One that you're probably all familiar with is the 2008-2009 economic and financial crisis that not only the United States but many other countries experienced simultaneously. From that point forward, it caused things to change. The way we run businesses, the different ramifications of legalities of businesses are much different now because of that financial and economic crisis that occurred in 2008 and 2009. So there was a causality there. And there are now also correlations that correlate to what occurred at that time. So we start to see when these critical points or these actual points of change occur, how it changes the industry, or perhaps how it changes the body of knowledge in the area that you're studying. What a timeline can do for you, as well as the reading audience of your work later, is to help inform the reader of what they may not know. Now, we can say in 2008 and 2009 there were these causal factors that occurred after that point in business, but not all the readers may know what you were going to articulate. If we go back farther in time, perhaps to the 1950s or after World War II, or even go back farther to the early 1900s, well, there weren't as many people alive then, and we don't know exactly what happened then, so we have to go back to the literature and find out. You will bring that forward. You will inform the reader of what they may not have known before. And more than likely, you're going to learn a lot more than you ever thought possible. The timeline can help connect themes and variables. In particular, for a quantitative study, if you're doing one dependent and 3 independent variables, the timeline may help you to see better how these independent variables came to be, or where they emerged at as compared to the timeline or the sequencing of your dependent variable and how it became prominent. When you start to use this timeline, you start to see these connections, then you start to get a very valuable chapter 2, and you're starting to write about something that perhaps nobody's ever considered before because they never did the timeline. They never paid attention to the emerging themes of times. Now, the emerging themes of 1950 are long gone, but at that time, the emergent themes in 1950 set the foundations for things that occurred in the body of knowledge in 1960s and the 1970s. You can think about it much like rock and roll. What we have today in rock and roll is not something that just happened overnight. There's a history about it. And even you can think about your life in the sense of a timeline. If you put your life in the timeline from the day you were born to where you're at now, we start to see that there are certain themes that occurred along the way. We already know that at a certain point you started to walk. At a certain point you started to talk. At a certain point you started to think on your own. You went to school. Maybe perhaps at a certain time you had a certain accident and that caused something to happen, a variable. Or you decided to join the service when you were 18, perhaps like I did. And that was a theme that then emerged in your timeline, just like it did for me, a theme that emerged in the essence of who I am, of my beliefs, my philosophies. And I can track those in a timeline and see how certain things change. If somebody wants to write my life story, or if I decide to write a biography, I would do something similar to that and start to see how my life changed and what the different variables were along the way and the different themes in my life. How to create a timeline. First, I suggest you show all the critical points of history. So for example, if you took a pen and paper out and you drew something from a time frame starting in 1900 to today, and you started to put in all the critical points of history, And I'll show an example here in a few moments because I put one together for you. And the idea here is you might put in from 1900 to where we're at today, put in all the different world wars that we had, all the different times of recessions from when they started to where they ended. Anything that's changed in particular, we know that there is this correlation of every time there was a war, let's say particularly World War I, as men went to war, women went to the workplace to help out in the factories while the men were gone. When the men came back from the war, the majority of the women went back home. But we see in history at World War II, when men went back to the war at that time, women did go to work, but when the men returned after World War II, more women stayed in the workplace. And we see that here's a critical point, because at that point forward, we started to see some changes in how different researchers and philosophers and people put together different models to take into effect the aspect of human behavior in the workplace. And we started to change how we led and how we managed in the workplace at that time. And it moved into providing different things that we see today that perhaps may not have been there otherwise. We can see critical points in the United States, for example, when presidents were shot and murdered, or when public figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. We see how those critical points of history have caused changes somehow, some way. And those are things you want to include in your timeline. You want to add in the timeline any of the journal authors' published works. Let's say, for example, you have somebody's work that's the mainstay or a major contributor created a theory. You might want to put when that person's work was going on. For example, in quality management theory, an area that I work in and study still, Frederick Taylor produced his book, The Theories of Scientific Management, in about 1909. His work was founded upon his work in the late 1800s and the first part of the decade in 1900s, and he published his work then. So I might write that in on my timeline, as well as then look at other journal authors such as perhaps Dr. Deming or Dr. Duran in the 50s, where productivity processes changed a bit with the introduction of what might be known as quality management theories and quality management tools that perhaps people like Ishikawa created with the cause and effect diagram, or the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle that was created around that time as well, or at least made popular. We could take a look at journal authors in that same content field and who started to create concepts based on Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma as we got into the latter part of the century, near the 1980s and 1990s, and then into the year 2000. So we start to see these journal authors' work. We could also start to include other people's work in there, because as things started changing in the workplace, we started to see more authors writing about perhaps emotional intelligence. We saw things about human development, organizational psychology. And if we look to those journal authors, the subject matter experts who founded the theories or created the models, we start to see correlations perhaps occurring, or if nothing else, at least we start to see how there's relationships and interrelationships, how one thing contributed to something else. We do have the opportunity in a timeline to reflect major shifts of thinking. For example, in 2008 and 2009, there were a few major shifts in thinking on how businesses were to be run. Some of that was from a legal perspective, some of it was from an operations perspective. As the internet became more popular in the late 1900s, we started to see how things started shifting in the way people were doing work. People were working from home. There were more people making money through the internet in a way that people have never seen before, because the internet was not available. So as different shifts of thinking occurred over time, we start to see how different aspects of models have been developed and emerging from that point forward. And the more you can relate to these major shifts of thinking in your industry, in the content areas that you're studying and writing about, the more powerful your work becomes. We can also suggest major conflicting perspectives. It's not uncommon that when one major author comes up with one point of view, there's other people that conflict with it. This is good. This is good because what we do is we learn more from conflicting points of view in most cases, and oftentimes ask better questions because we see an expanded view. So if by chance you're writing something about how people were being treated as far as minorities and fair and equal treatment, we could see that at certain times in the United States, when there were race riots and with Martin Luther King Jr. being shot, we start to see that there were changes, positive changes from that point forward. And at initial times during that view, there were conflicting perspectives. Not to say that any of them were right or wrong. Some of them were definitely right. Some of them were definitely wrong. But in your work, you would write information to show that there was conflicting perspectives so that you could then, what we call, synthesize all these views, analyze them, and then evaluate that analysis, evaluate that synthesis. Because that's the power of your chapter 2, is when you're able to show the critical points of history, who the major authors were, major shifts of thinking, and major conflicting perspectives. You start to see, when you can write like this, the power that's going to be in your work. How to present relationships and interrelationships in Chapter 2 based on a timeline is what I want to discuss with you a little bit now. Where to put this would be after you review the major headings of the literature review. So perhaps you're doing a quantitative study. You would talk about the dependent, the independent variables, and then you would go into writing about the relationships and interrelationships of all those variables. If you're doing a qualitative study, perhaps you're writing about different themes or different concepts based on the study that you're working on. You would have those themes or concepts first, and then you would bring out these relationships and interrelationships near the latter third or the latter fourth of your chapter. You would do this in a narrative via paragraphs. This is content writing, where you might describe what you saw from a timeline perspective. Think about it if you were writing a story for a newspaper. It's not any different than writing the story in your dissertation, with the exception of the choice of words and the context of some of the words in which you're going to apply. You can, and I encourage you to, is to create a mind map. You may want to use the mind map as a figure in this section as well when you talk to relationships and interrelationships, because when you do, people can see when they're reading your work, the consumer of your dissertation will be able to see perhaps better in a map, in a picture form, than they could read otherwise. The only caution I have here for you is that some mind maps, sometimes also known as concept maps, can be quite complex. And while you're able to blow it up on your computer, perhaps when it's printed in a dissertation, it may not be able to have the opportunity to expand it like you can do in a PDF. So you want to make sure that anytime you're using any kind of figure or table, that's going to add value to your work and not detract it. So you may want to do a mind map. It may even be good for you to do that and not include it in your work. That's up to you. Same thing with the figure. You can certainly include this figure in when you start writing about relationships and interrelationships. Again, you might want to consider, is that figure going to be displayed in a way that adds value to work? Now, what you're going to see in the figures that I have drawn out, just to use as an example for this lesson, I have a timeline of over 100 years, but then you can also break it down into snapshots of 25-year or even 10-year increments if that's so desired, because you want to show something that you believe is going to add value to your work. And then finally, I always say that when you start relating, whether it's going to be a mind map, whether it's going to be the timeline, or how you're going to create your narrative, that you have to decide what's best for your work. Of course, you're going to coordinate with your dissertation chair and your committee members and get views on it. Most dissertation committee members that I'm aware of do not encourage the use of mind maps and timelines in the work. And I don't think it's because of any other reason other than the fact that they probably have not seen it. I think most would agree that the idea of a mind map and a timeline would be great to use to help you conceive and organize your chapter 2 before you write it, because a mind map and a timeline can just provide you that insight that allow you then to create your major headings and subheadings for your paragraphs that are going to follow in your chapter 2. But they may not be in tune or inclined to having you put all these kind of maps or timelines in your work. Oftentimes, I suggest if it's not going to be in the chapter and you think it's of value, then reference it in the chapter and use it as an appendix, because that's an option too. You can put it as an appendix. But again, if it's more complex in the sense of how much can fit on one page in your work, you have to really consider, is it better to include it or not to include it? Now what I'm going to do is show you an example that I just drafted quickly so that you can at least get the concept. You can certainly go online at any place and find information about timelines and how to create them. My goal here is not to teach you how to create a timeline or define what a timeline actually is, but just to show you perhaps the value of a timeline to you in the early stages of drafting your chapter, or to include it should you decide to. Now this may be a little hard for you to read, I'm not sure, depending on what kind of computer you have. If you're reading this on a smartphone, well, you may not be able to see it as easily as you might like to. But what I have here is a timeline that goes and starts before 1900 and comes up to present time. And what I did on the top is I put in red some of what I call historical factors, the years of the start and end of the different wars that were going on in the United States during 1900s. So World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Gulf War. Then I also put in other aspects of what was going on as far as when recessions occurred, perhaps other points of history when women were allowed to vote in the United States, assassinations of publicly known figures, whether they were held office or not, and then other information that I thought was important. Now what you find below the timeline, this is just my approach because I don't like to put too much on the top. I like to use all the white space. And so below the timeline, you start to see things that are more related to the literature. These are where major authors occurred. For example, the great man thinking theory, if you will, of leadership was before the 1900s. We also had the ancient Greek philosophies before the 1900s. We see when John Adler or Chester Bernard or when Frederick Taylor did his work, when Max Weber did his work, we start to see different aspects on the theories below, the subject matter experts. And as you build yours, you can start to see perhaps maybe some relationships and correlations. Now what I'm going to do on the next slide here is I'm going to blow up the one part of it. So you can see the first perhaps 50 years or so in a easier to read view than the prior slide. So what you have here is, as I started to see what happened in World War I with women going into the workplace, we started to see at a certain point where we started to get Mitzberg's organizational psychology theory not too far after World War II. We started to see Max Weber's work on hierarchical levels. And this is an extension of what had started in the early 1900s, whether it be through Chester Bernard's work on communications or Frederick Taylor's on scientific management. John Adler's work in action leadership preceded the 1900s, and we can start to see, if you will, on this timeline, how one author's work had something to do with the work down the line. As we got into the 1930s and areas, we started to see how the humanistic theory came into place, and we started just to see more aspects of work changes based on productivity and organizational design and development in professional settings. Now this slide here takes us from 1950s maybe to current day settings, if you will, and we started to see when Freud's work started to come into play, when systems theory, we started to see where Deming and Duran's work in Japan led into these quality management theories, and how then Drucker with management by objectives came up, and McGregor's theory. We started seeing X and Y theory, total quality management, Six Sigma, chaos theory, Lean Six Sigma. But as you start to see, this is a rudimentary timeline. Now think about this. As you're reviewing the literature, if you're creating this timeline, when you start to see something in an article or a book that you read and they talk about how something changed or how somebody created a new concept and you wrote it in your timeline. Write it in your timeline as you're doing your review of the literature. A time to create a timeline is not after you've done it all, your literature review, but as you're starting to find articles. Oftentimes when you start to do this type of work with a mind map, or in this case, the timeline, what you start to see is your articles start to fall in place on the ones you want to use and the ones you're going to discard. And this process alone of creating a timeline may help you sift through thousands of articles to find maybe the 100 or 125 articles that you may need for your chapter 2 that are relevant to what you want to write about. Timeline can be done any way you want. You may have a fancy computer program for it. There's nothing wrong with that. I just like to do this on a dry erase board if I have it. If not, I do it on a piece of paper at home. And oftentimes it's not so much about whether it looks good or not. It's about how informative it becomes. You can start to easily see here that there are some things that have happened that have caused other things to occur after it. You may not be able to see direct correlations here, but we can start to see some, or at least it opens up the question for us to say, I wonder what happened there. What's going on at that time frame? Maybe between 1950 and 1960, I need to spend more time in there because it seems like there was a lot going on between, McGregor and Drucker and Maslow and Dr. Deming's work. Did any of this happen to do with these wars that we were in? I don't know. But when we start to look at it, we may start to see more insights and more information coming together. And we may then be able to draw some implications or conclusions based on the timeline that could help strengthen our work beyond anybody's thought. And I've seen this happen many times where early on students are writing their chapter 2 and they're just trying to put references together, and what their work seems like more than anything else is a string of quotes and paraphrases, and they're appearing to focus on the citations and not the story and not the concepts and not the history or the trends. What you see here helps you to focus on what's important, not who wrote what article. If it was helpful to you, if it was, then tell your cohorts and your peers about this program, because there's no reason why anybody should be all but dissertation. Let's get everybody through and increase the graduation rates. Thank you.